Pyrgi, coastal Lazio, Italy, June 1964. An archaeologist named Massimo Palatino lifts a wooden box from temple sediment. The box is partially charred, burned in a raid carried out by Dionysius of Syracuse, 384 BCE. Inside the box, 3 sheets of hammered gold leaf, not corroded, not crumbled, still legible. After 2,500 years, the words are still there. 2 sheets are written in Etruscan, 1 in Phoenician. They are the oldest historical documents ever recovered from Italian soil, older than the Roman Republic itself. And the language on 2 of those 3 sheets is still only partially understood today. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. The tablets record a dedication by Thafari Velianus, king of the Etruscan city of Caire, to the Phoenician goddess Ashtaret. But here's what makes them strange. The Etruscan text and the Phoenician text don't perfectly translate each other. They tell the same event in different cultural vocabularies, which means the Etruscans weren't translating for the Phoenicians. They were speaking to them as partners, equals, people who shared a world and didn't need to explain themselves to each other. That detail matters more than it seems. We'll come back to why. The Pyrgi gold tablets are the best key we have ever found to the Etruscan language, and they're still not enough. Because Etruscan is not a language that gives itself up easily. It has no confirmed relatives, no traceable parent, no surviving cousins in any language family known to exist. It sits in the historical record like an object that fell from somewhere we cannot locate. For 2.5 millennia, historians assumed the explanation was geography. The Etruscans must have come from somewhere else, somewhere to the east, where different languages and different people had different roots. Herodotus said so. Scholars repeated it. And then, in 2025, a team of geneticists at the University of Tübingen sequenced DNA from 82 ancient graves across Etruria, and the explanation that had stood for 2,500 years collapsed in a single dataset. The genetic data didn't just revise the assumption, it inverted it. And the inversion made the language harder to explain, not easier. You are looking at a language no one alive can fully read, written by people whose DNA has now been recovered, and the 2 datasets do not agree with each other in ways that should be impossible. If you've ever actually wondered where a civilization comes from, not the history book version, but the biological answer underneath it, then you're going to want to stay. Because what this story reveals goes deeper than most people are willing to follow. The last Etruscan inscription in the archaeological record was written around 100 CE. By then, the person writing it was living in a world where no one around them spoke the language. The gold tablets in that charred wooden box were already 500 years old. They wrote in Etruscan anyway. That language has been dead for 2,000 years. And yet, 2 languages currently spoken in isolated communities in the Eastern Alps and on a Greek island carry structural features that have no Indo-European explanation. One of them is spoken by fewer than 500 people who have no idea they may be carrying the last audible echo of the tongue on those gold tablets. Spoken. That word is going to matter. Herodotus, writing in 440 BCE, was not guessing. He was specific. The Etruscans, he said, came from Lydia, western Anatolia, modern Turkey, fleeing a famine under the reign of King Aetus. He had sources. Lydian traders, Aegean shipping routes, cultural parallels he could point to. For 2,500 years, this claim sat in the historical record as either the foundational truth of Etruscan studies or its foundational error. It turned out to be neither. In 2014, a genome-wide study of modern Tuscan populations found something that looked, at first, like vindication for Herodotus. There was a clear genetic signal of Middle Eastern ancestry in the modern Tuscan gene pool. Scholars cited it repeatedly as genomic support for the Anatolian origin theory. It was used in papers, in lectures, in popular articles. The data was real. The interpretation was completely wrong. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what everyone assumed. Cosimo Post had spent years working on ancient DNA at the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and Paleoenvironment at the University of Tübingen in Germany. In 2021, his team published something that reframed the entire field. What Post found when his team sequenced DNA directly from people buried in Etruscan necropolises, not their modern descendants, but the Etruscans themselves, was that the Middle Eastern genetic signal everyone had been pointing to had nothing to do with Etruscan origins. That signal arrived in Tuscany approximately 600 years after the Etruscan civilization reached its peak. It was deposited during the Roman imperial period. By people Rome moved west from Syria, Egypt, and the Levant. Herodotus pointed east. He was pointing at a genetic signal that wouldn't arrive in Tuscany until centuries after he was dead, carried by people who had nothing to do with the Etruscans, for completely different reasons under a completely different empire. This is not a minor correction. This is 150 years of scholarship built on a real signal found in the wrong century. Among the 82 ancient individuals Post and his team sequenced, the Etruscan-era individuals, people buried between 800 and 1 BCE, showed zero evidence of recent Anatolian admixture. Not reduced, not partial, zero. These were real people from Etruscan cemeteries. Their DNA does not point east. It points inward, toward the same gene pool as their Latin neighbors in early Rome, which destroys the assumption that had organized the entire field. The assumption that Etruscan cultural distinctiveness had a biological source, that the language, the religion, the art, the political sophistication, that all of it came from a different genetic stock than the people living next door. The genomic data says they were, biologically, the people living next door. The difference was entirely constructed, entirely cultural, entirely chosen. And that is far stranger than a migration from Anatolia ever would have been. The genetic method that confirmed Etruscan foreign origin for 2 decades wasn't wrong because the data was bad. It was wrong because the signal it found was real. It just belonged to a different people, a different century, and an entirely different act of history. The story of how Rome erased the Etruscans is written in modern Italian DNA. Nobody was reading it correctly, written in DNA. That's where the real record lives. Somewhere in the Pontic Caspian steppe, approximately 2500 BCE, a population of pastoralists begins moving west. They carry a Y chromosome marker called R1b. They carry steppe-associated ancestry in their autosomes, the non-sex chromosomes that track overall biological heritage. They speak an early form of Proto-Indo-European. Over the next 800 years, their descendants will restructure the genetics and the languages of Europe. They will reach the Atlantic coast, the British Isles, and eventually the Italian peninsula. In one specific valley in what will become Tuscany, they will fail at the language part. And that failure will produce the most enigmatic civilization the ancient world ever recorded. What Post's 2021 study found in the Etruscan graves was unambiguous. Approximately 75% of Y chromosome markers among Iron Age Etruscans, people buried between 800 and 1 BCE, belong to the R1b lineage. Specifically, a variant called R1b-P312 and its derived form R1b-L2, the bell-beaker-associated lineage that spread across Western Europe during the Bronze Age. Steppe-related ancestry had arrived in central Italy as early as 1650 BCE. By the Iron Age, it was the dominant ancestral component in every population on the Italian peninsula. Latins, Etruscans, all of them. This discovery was hiding in plain sight for years. Nobody talked about what it actually meant, until now. The Y chromosome marker most common in the men buried in Etruscan necropolises is the same lineage carried by bell-beaker pastoralists in the Rhine Valley 1200 years earlier. The Etruscans did not arrive from the East arrived in them, and they kept the language that was already there. The Post study describes this directly, and the language used is scientific understatement for something philosophically radical. The persistence of Etruscan as a non-Indo-European language in a population carrying Indo-European steppe ancestry, the paper states, represents a rare example of language continuity despite large-scale genetic replacement. Read that again slowly. The people who became Etruscans absorbed waves of steppe migrants without absorbing their language. They converted people without being converted. There is one parallel in the entire archaeological record: the Basque region of northern Spain. Basques today carry steppe-derived Y chromosomes in the majority, the genetic signature of Bronze Age Indo-European expansion, the same expansion that reached Etruria. But Basques still speak Basque. the only pre-Indo-European language on the Iberian Peninsula to survive. Post's paper explicitly draws this comparison. Two populations on opposite ends of Europe, both carrying the genetics of people who spoke Indo-European, and both refusing the language. Because culture can outlast the biology of its bearers. That's what both cases prove. The assumption destroyed here is one of the deepest in archaeology, that wherever Indo-European steppe genetics arrived, Indo-European language followed. It did not. In at least 2 documented cases, something resisted. And if language can survive genetic replacement, then the death of Etruscan as a living tongue was not a biological event. It was a social one. A social destruction requires a social perpetrator. The steppe wave that gave the Etruscans their genetic majority left no Etruscan language descendants anywhere else on the continent. The language they were preserving had no genetic homeland on the steppe, no surviving relatives in Anatolia, no traceable phylogenetic cousins in the ancient Near East. It came from somewhere that no longer exists in the genetic record, and may have been spoken across most of pre-Bronze Age Europe before the steppe migrations buried it. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Drop your answer in the comments. Where in the world is your family ancestry from? I mean it. I read them, because what I'm about to say may connect to your own biology more directly than you'd expect. The Eastern Alpine Passes, approximately 2,100 to 1,800 BCE. The Bell Beaker Complex, a loose network of steppe-derived populations carrying R1b, has been moving westward across Europe for 3 centuries. Their advance into the Italian peninsula was not a flood, it was a bottleneck. The route south required crossing alpine passes at altitude, passes that could close for years at a time, in seasons that permitted no transit at all. In December 2024, the largest Mediterranean ancient DNA study ever published appeared on bioRxiv. 314 ancient individuals spanning thousands of years of Mediterranean prehistory. What it showed about how steppe ancestry reached Italy was something the field had not clearly established before. The steppe ancestry in Spain, France, and Italy did not arrive directly from the eastern Yamnaya heartland the way it reached Greece or the Armenian highlands. It arrived via Bell Beaker Western European populations, people who were themselves already several generations of admixed ancestry removed from the original steppe source by the time they reached the Alps. But here's where it gets strange, which means the people who crossed those alpine passes and eventually settled in what became Tuscany were not steppe pastoralists. They were already hybrid, already Western Europeans carrying a steppe memory. The Etruscans are not children of the steppe. They are grandchildren. A 2021 study in Current Biology by Saupa and colleagues documented structural shifts in Italian peninsula ancestry following steppe arrival, and found that the admixture process was ongoing and incomplete as late as 2000 BCE. This was not a single migration event. It was a slow seep across centuries, which means there were at minimum 200 years when Italy's genetic future was genuinely contingent, when the passage could have failed, when the winter could have won. Among the Etruscan individuals in post-study, a lineage called G2A, the pre-steppe Anatolian Neolithic farmer marker, persists at significant frequency even in the Iron Age population. These are the biological descendants of Italy's original Neolithic farmers, people whose language is now completely unrecoverable, who survived the steppe admixture wave, whose genetic legacy still sits in the Etruscan genome alongside the R1b majority, quiet, ancient, unacknowledged. Consider what this means. The Bell Beaker corridor that seeded central Italy with the ancestry that would produce the Etruscans, the Latins, and eventually Rome, was contingent on a geographic choke point crossing the Alps over 2 centuries of uncertain transit. One sustained demographic collapse in those mountain passes, one generation that failed to push through. And the Italian peninsula's Bronze Age looks entirely different. The Etruscans do not exist. Early Rome does not exist as we know it. 98% of today's central Italian population carries R1b-P312 as a significant Y chromosomal component, a lineage traced directly to that Bell Beaker intrusion. Every person in Tuscany carries biological evidence of a migration that nearly didn't reach them. And the language that migration brought, Proto-Indo-European, the parent of Latin, French, English, and Hindi, failed to extinguish the one tongue it found already living in the valley it entered. Etruria. Let's settle this. By the end of the Iron Age in central Italy, the genomic data is unambiguous. Etruscans and Latins share the same genetic profile. The same blend of Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, and Bronze Age steppe-related ancestry, in the same proportions from the same regional sources. The 82 individual time transect from post-study shows genetic continuity across 800 years of Etruscan civilization with no detectable signal of external migration. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BCE, argued the Etruscans were an indigenous Italian people. He was right. The debate that lasted 2,500 years, from Herodotus to the genome labs of Tübingen, is over. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. If you have any ancestry from Tuscany, Umbria, or Lazio, the people who built Rome's sewers, trained Rome's priests, and taught Rome's aristocracy how to read omens from the livers of animals are part of your biological inheritance. The origin mystery is solved, but you're about to find out that solving it opens something worse. The post-study is direct on this point. Among the 82 individuals, the local gene pool is largely maintained across the 1st millennium BCE, despite documented contact with North African, Near Eastern, and Central European individuals in the archaeological record. No recent Anatolian admixture, no exotic intrusion. Local, continuous, confirmed. The music settles, the map closes. Steppe ancestry, Bronze Age Italy, Iron Age Etruria, local origin confirmed. And then one new fact lands. And it should not be able to land this hard after a resolution. The Etruscan language has no traceable genetic homeland. The people who spoke it carried the DNA of Bronze Age steppe migrants, Indo-European speakers by every genomic metric. Yet they spoke a pre-Indo-European language isolate, which means one of two things must be true. Either the language survived in this population because they culturally absorbed incoming steppe migrants so completely that the migrants' language never took root, or the language arrived with the steppe migrants themselves and was already non-Indo-European at the steppe source. Neither possibility has a satisfactory explanation in the current scientific literature. Neither. The Etruscan corpus, 13,000 inscriptions recovered. Most are funerary, most are formulaic. The language is partially readable, names, dedications, fragments of religious vocabulary. But the texts that would tell us how the language was transmitted, who taught it to whom, how it survived the Bronze Age admixture, those texts do not exist. The Etruscans left no literature, no philosophy in their own words, no mythology they recorded themselves. 13,000 inscriptions, and we are still almost entirely reading tombstones. Solving the genetic origin of this civilization answered something real, and then it placed us in a room with no floor. The biology is resolved. The civilization is more inexplicable than before. The genomic data makes the Etruscans and the early Romans biologically the same people. The civilization that absorbed, Romanized, and ultimately silenced the Etruscan language was, in every measurable genetic sense, built from the same Bronze Age population that produced the Etruscans. They were not conquered by strangers. They were absorbed by cousins. Family. That word is going to become uncomfortable. Here is the accepted historical timeline. Rome conquered Etruria militarily across the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Veii fell in 396 BCE. Volsini was destroyed in 264 BCE. By the 1st century BCE, Etruscan culture had been absorbed. And attached to this military timeline is a standard assumption, that the genetic replacement of Etruria was an imperial-era event, that the foreign ancestry now detectable in modern Tuscans arrived after Rome declared itself an empire. A 2023 reanalysis of ancient Roman genomic data revised that assumption by 200 years. Margaret Antonio had spent years building the most comprehensive ancient DNA picture of Rome ever assembled at Stanford University in the United States. In 2019, her team published a study in Science examining 127 ancient Roman genomes spanning the city's entire history. What she found in the Republican-era layers, the period before Rome was even formally an empire, was that Eastern Mediterranean ancestry was already appearing in the Central Italian gene pool by approximately 200 BCE. Significant enough to be demographically measurable. Significant enough that the Etruscan gene pool had begun changing before Rome won its final military campaigns in Etruria. Everything I just told you about military conquest being the cause, hold on to it. Because it's about to mean something completely different, which means Etruscans living in their own cities, practicing their own religion, writing in their own script, were already watching their genetic profile change from the inside. Not because of military defeat, because of commerce, because of the port networks and trade routes and labor markets of the Mediterranean, the same economic integration the Etruscans themselves had participated in and partially built. The Pyrgi gold tablets, those 3 sheets of hammered gold from the box in the ash, are a record of Etruscan commercial and religious alliance with Carthage, dated 500 BCE. Evidence of the very economic connectivity that would eventually flood Etruria with non-Etruscan genetics. The Etruscans built the commercial world that unmade them. Among the Republican-era individuals in Antonio's study, ancestry signals from the Levant, North Africa, and Anatolia are already appearing. Not yet dominant, but present and growing. The Etruscans' trading partners were becoming their neighbors, then their neighbors' children, then the majority. The assumption that falls here is the one that organized the entire popular narrative, that Etruscan genetic erasure was caused by Roman military power. It was not. It was caused by Roman commercial success. The same Mediterranean economic system the Etruscans had helped construct began moving people westward before the legions had finished moving east. The civilization that structurally ended the Etruscans was, in significant part, their own creation. The formal political end of Etruscan independence is dated to the 1st century BCE. The genetic end of a recognizable Etruscan population profile, in the data from Post's study, predates the imperial period. The last inscription written in the Etruscan language dates to approximately 100 CE. By then, the genetic profile of whoever wrote it was already 50% Eastern Mediterranean. That number, 50%. We need to stop and look at it directly. Empire. That's where the number lives. By 100 CE, Rome's population has reached 1 million people, the first city in European history to do so. Antonio's team sequenced 48 individuals from the imperial period. The finding, stated in the paper without softening, fewer than 30% of those individuals had genetic ties to early Italian ancestors. The rest, more than 70%, traced their primary ancestry to the Eastern Mediterranean. The city at the center of Western civilization was, genetically, a Middle Eastern city by the time it reached its peak. There are 3 things the combined data from Post and Antonio reveals. The third one is the one that changes everything. The first, Etruscans were local. Confirmed. The second, the genetic shift that ended the Etruscan gene pool began before Rome was an empire. Confirmed. The third, the Post study documents an abrupt population-wide shift to approximately 50% admixture with Eastern Mediterranean ancestry across central Italy during the imperial period. Not gradual. In genomic terms, rapid. The proposed mechanism? The movement of enslaved people, soldiers, and merchants from Roman provinces in the Near East, Egypt, and the Levant, in numbers sufficient to rewrite the genetics of the entire Central Italian population within approximately 300 years. 50%, half of Central Italy's genome was rewritten by people who did not come willingly. The last speaker of Etruscan, whoever wrote that inscription near Perugia around 100 CE, was, biologically, already half Eastern Mediterranean. The language they were writing in was a ghost. Their genome had already moved on. The Etruscans spoke a language 5,000 years older than Latin. They built the sewers under Rome. They trained Rome's priests. Their architectural innovations became Rome's foundational civic infrastructure. Genetically, they were indistinguishable from the Romans who absorbed them, and every modern Italian's genome is shaped not by the Etruscans, not by the Romans in the traditional sense, but by the Eastern Mediterranean people displaced by the empire those Etruscans helped build. Modern Tuscans are, in genetic terms, the grandchildren of Rome's imperial labor system, not of the civilization that built Rome. Among the enslaved and displaced populations documented moving into central Italy during the imperial period, people from Syria, the Levant, Egypt, and Anatolia. Some were highly educated, scribes, physicians, tutors. Some built the structures that still stand. The Antonio study documents that these individuals were biologically diverse, drawn from across the Near East, and that their genetic signature, not the Etruscans, not the early Latins, is the dominant ancestral component in modern central and southern Italian populations. The 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture that ended the Etruscan gene pool was not a military event. It was a labor event. It was the biological consequence of an economic system that moved human beings as a commodity, and those human beings' DNA became permanently the majority ancestry of the region. Modern Italian identity does not descend from Roman citizens. It descends in the majority from Roman subjects. And this didn't stop at Italy. The genetic marker of this demographic shift spread through Rome's network into populations across the Mediterranean basin and into Western Europe. If you have European ancestry that traces through the Roman-influenced Mediterranean, you carry a statistical probability of inheriting a fraction of the genetics of the people who built Rome's infrastructure under conditions they did not choose. That is not a metaphor. That is what the population genetics literature now permits us to say. Map. Look at central Italy right now. The gradient runs north to south. Tuscany and northern Lazio show a slightly higher residual component of pre-Roman Iron Age ancestry. Southern Lazio, Campania, the Rome metropolitan region, highest concentrations of Eastern Mediterranean admixture. This is not coincidence. This is the genomic scar of the Roman imperial labor system, frozen in geography, and it maps with unsettling precision onto contemporary Italian regional identity politics. Post's study found that in Tuscany, Lazio, and Basilicata, the population's ancestry remained largely continuous between the early medieval period and today. The gene pool of modern central and southern Italians was substantially formed by approximately 1000 CE and has changed relatively little since. The Eastern Mediterranean admixture component that arrived under Imperial Rome is not diluted out. It is the foundation. Now, here is what nobody talks about. There is a small region in Tuscany, the Casentino Valley, and the area around Volterra, where ancient mitochondrial DNA studies found something statistically remarkable. A 2013 study in PLOS One confirmed that the ancient Etruscans can be considered ancestral, with high confidence, to the current inhabitants of those specific communities. Everywhere else in Tuscany, the Etruscan genome was absorbed into the imperial era admixture. In those valleys, it held. Think about that for a second. The genetic fault line between pre-Roman Etruscan origin ancestry and imperial-era Eastern Mediterranean ancestry runs approximately along the Arno River, roughly the boundary between northern Tuscany and southern Tuscany and Lazio. This is also approximately the boundary of the most charged regional identity claims in modern central Italy. The genetic fault line and the cultural fault line are not identical, but they overlap in ways that deserve more investigation than they have received. There is a village called Merlo in Siena province, in the heart of Tuscany. It was the subject of a 2004 study that found modern male inhabitants of Merlo carry mitochondrial DNA signatures statistically closer to ancient Etruscan individuals than to any other Tuscan population. Merlo was, in the Iron Age, the site of an elite Etruscan aristocratic center, a palatial structure excavated in the 1960s, decorated with extraordinary terracotta programs. The people living there now, in a village that still exists with a postal code, may carry a genetic thread 2,700 years old, a thread that survived Roman imperial admixture, medieval migrations, and the early medieval Longobard readmixture documented in Post's later layers. The conflict between Etruscan Etruria and Latin Rome was never a war between foreign peoples. It was a civil war between populations of the same genetic stock, fought over a language, a priesthood, a particular way of reading the sky. And in 2 or 3 specific valleys in Tuscany, that conflict is, in a measurable biological sense, still not entirely over. The Etruscan genome didn't disappear completely. It survived in the places where the Roman trade routes were thin, the ports were distant, and the demographic waves broke before they reached the hills. Now, This is where we are right now, northern Etruria, the site of ancient Populonia on the Tyrrhenian coast, one of the most important Etruscan cities of the Iron Age, a metallurgical center whose iron smelting operations left dark slag deposits still visible on the shoreline today, the iron still bleeding into the sand after 2,500 years. Populonia has been partially excavated. The ancient DNA from its Iron Age necropolis is not yet fully published. The researchers who hold those samples know what they might tell us. The publication has not yet arrived. The post-2021 study is explicit about this. More ancient DNA from across Italy is needed to support the conclusions already reached. The northern Etruscan sites, Populonia, Vetulonia, Marsiliana d'Albegna, are underrepresented in the genomic record. These are precisely the sites where the Bronze Age to Iron Age transition in Etruria is archaeologically documented in the most detail. The transitional period between Villanovan culture and Etruscan emergence, roughly 900 to 750 BCE, is the genomic black box. That's the window where the answer to the language problem almost certainly lives. The question of how a non-Indo-European language survived in a population carrying steppe ancestry for 800 years, that question may be sitting in a soil layer at a specific site in northern Tuscany that no one has fully sequenced. The question is not closed, it is paused. If you carry Western European ancestry, Italian, French, or Iberian specifically, you carry R1b-P312. You carry the Bell-Beaker corridor's genetic trace through those alpine passes that nearly closed. You carry a statistical fraction of the Eastern Mediterranean admixture that remade Rome and buried the Etruscan gene pool in the process. And there is a small, measurable probability that somewhere in your mitochondrial DNA, the line passed only through mothers, unbroken, you carry a haplogroup that was already ancient when the Etruscans were building their first cities. This is not metaphor. This is what the population genetics literature now permits us to say. If this is the kind of question that keeps you awake at night, subscribe, because the answer to the language problem may be published before this series is finished, and when it arrives, we'll be here. The last Etruscan inscription in the archaeological record was written around 100 CE at a site near Perugia during the height of the Roman Empire. The person who wrote it was living in a world where the empire around them spoke Latin, where the ports have been reshaped by centuries of Eastern Mediterranean arrivals, where the gold tablets in the burned box at Pyrgi were already 500 years in the ground. We don't know their name. We don't know if they knew they were the last. They wrote in Etruscan anyway.